Welcome everyone, and thank you for joining us as we release results from the Los Angeles portion of the 2022 NFF State of Nonprofit Sector Survey. Bank of America is pleased to support the LA component of the national survey, which collected data, stories, and advice from more than 200 nonprofit leaders in Los Angeles about the impact of the past 2 years, from the pandemic to calls for racial justice. We are also pleased that we were able to support the entire national survey, which not only yielded interesting results in and of itself, but also showed some interesting differences between the experiences of LA nonprofits and those in the rest of the country. This exploration of the LA nonprofit community was developed and conducted in collaboration with the Pat Brown Institute at Cal State Los Angeles, the Committee for Greater LA, and our local advisory committee comprised of Antelope Valley Partners in Health, California Community Foundation, California Immigrant Policy Center, Camera Girls in Action, Southeast LA Collaborative, and Social Justice Learning Institute. Their work has already enhanced the impact of NFF's national survey. We hope it will also support your work, those of you who lead or participate in this region's vibrant nonprofit communities. And now, to talk more about the LA County survey and to walk us through its findings, I would like to introduce Dr. Rafe Sonnenschein, Executive Director of the Pat Brown Institute.
Thank you, Raul. Thanks for the introduction, and thank you to the Bank of America for supporting this important work at the national and Los Angeles level. And as Raul indicated, this is the collective work of 3 organizations and other organizations in a supportive and participatory role. The Nonprofit Finance Fund at the national scene in New York and locally in LA, the Pat Brown Institute for Public Affairs at Cal State LA, and the Committee for Greater LA, and the numerous nonprofit organizations who supported us throughout this project. So we are going to begin now. And I'm going to jump right into an explanation, a quick explanation of the methodology of this survey. This was a national survey led and done by the Nonprofit Finance Fund that collaborated with the Viteris and Ambit 360, and SRSS was the survey administrator. There was more than 1,000 leaders of organizations were surveyed nationwide, over 1,100, and of those, a very significant percentage were done here in Los Angeles. And we're very excited about the carve out of this survey and the commitment of NFF to find out what LA's nonprofit community believes. It was in the field from the middle of January through early March. And throughout this, we all worked together to make sure that the LA component really told the unique LA story in the nonprofit world. Maybe most importantly, throughout this process, we all worked together with existing nonprofits in LA to make sure we are on the right track, to get advice on the questionnaire, to think about what kind of specific questions really had to be looked at. We had an advisory committee that Raul has already mentioned that was with us from beginning to end, and you'll also see them represented in the panel. But we also had 2 feedback groups that we're very, very grateful to, of nonprofits who gave us very blunt and clear advice about our direction. And you'll see that their impact really was significant throughout this. We're very, very excited about the fact that the participatory model was such an important part of this. Just as a note about the methodology, when you see data coming forward, unless noted otherwise, this is referring to the LA survey. When we're going to talk about the national survey, we'll make clear that that's what that is. So let's begin with a little bit of the profile of the Los Angeles nonprofits who responded to our survey. First of all, you'll see everybody has seen the map of Los Angeles County. Those who haven't, sometimes it's worth being reminded of the vast size and geographical range of Los Angeles County. If it was a state, it would be the 10th largest state in the United States, with more than 10 million people. And much of the service world of Los Angeles is built around what's called service planning areas, or SPAs, where social services are really directed by the county. And we heard the most from 4 of the SPAs, which is East LA, Metro Los Angeles, San Fernando Valley, and South Los Angeles. But we heard from the other communities as well. We got a pretty good spread throughout the spas. But keep this map in mind, just because later on in the program, we're going to talk a bit about LA County and dealing with this gigantic government system in LA County. The first thing we find is how incredibly important in Los Angeles's nonprofit community are direct services to the community. 72% of the nonprofit leaders indicated that direct services were a critical part of their mission. And that's a pretty striking thing, because what we're going to talk about later is how important it is that the capacity of nonprofits to address direct services is fundamental. They're not going to change their mission. The question is, will they have the capacity to carry this out? Also, strikingly in Los Angeles is how many of the nonprofits are not just looking at direct services, but are trying to change the system. Policy, advocacy, systems reform. And I think all of us on this call are aware of how much the conversation in the Los Angeles community among nonprofits and with many others as well is about not just continuing to provide services, but changing the system itself. And I think that's something for us to keep in mind throughout, that our mission is to make sure that the system is the most responsive it can be. We got a pretty wide spread of communities represented in the leadership of Los Angeles nonprofits. And the first thing we would say is that the majority of LA's nonprofit leaders in our survey are BIPOC. And if you see the pie chart on the left, you'll see about a third are white-led. You've got 20% Hispanic-led, 19% Black-led, AAPI at about 18%. And there's a good diversity to allow us to draw some conclusions about the differences among organizations based on leadership. We also asked whether the executive director or CEO is a person whose lived experiences are representative of one or more of the communities their organization serves. And here we find our first real difference here, which is among the BIPOC-led organizations, almost 60% report that sort of parallel, and only 16% of the white-led organizations, and that's just an important piece of data. And overall in LA, though, to keep in mind, almost half do have that connection of the top person to the communities that they're serving. Now we start to mix some different types of data together for you to think about, and we start to think about capacity now a bit. Number one is that there's a great variety of organizational sizes that we talk to. And one of the concerns you might have with a survey like this is, did you only talk to small organizations? Did you only talk to large organizations? If you look on the right-hand side, on total LA, we find that 34% of those we spoke with have budgets under $500,000, 27% up to $2 million, and 39% over $2 million. So the first thing to understand is that we, again, have a diverse representation of size of organizations. The second thing you may notice, however, is that there is a connection between whether the organizations are white-led or BIPOC-led in terms of budget size. So just to quickly look, among BIPOC-led organizations, 27% have budgets larger than 2 million, but 56% of the white-led organizations. Conversely, 45% of BIPOC-led organizations are smaller in terms of budget size, and 18% of the white-led organizations would be considered small. So as we go through this and look about capacity, keep in mind that very often capacity has to do with budget, and budget may be connected with different sorts of folks who are leading different kinds of organizations. Everybody's working unbelievably hard in all these organizations. What we're really trying to find out is how to make sure that the capacity is really spread around in the most equitable and effective manner possible. Now we go through the findings one at a time. The number one finding, and this is a word I want you to keep in mind throughout this entire day, is the word demand. Because what you're hearing in the kind of mainstream world of media discussions is that the pandemic is just about over. Things are going to return to, quote, normal, whatever that means. But what we're finding in the nonprofit world is increased demand is persistent. It is not cresting. It is not going backwards. So first of all, more than 70% of LA's nonprofits reported a significant increase in demand. And that was even stronger in the BIPOC-led organizations compared to white-led organizations. Not a tremendous difference, but it's an important difference, because now we start connecting demand and capacity. The very organizations that are experiencing the largest demand may need greater support and direction and help in many ways, and resources to make sure they have the capacity to meet that demand. And if you look on the right side, you find fewer than half of the organizations of all types feel they are able to meet increased demand during this period, that people are trying to keep their heads above water in terms of meeting this demand. And it must be frustrating to hear people say, good news, the crisis is over, the demand is going to go backwards. Because as it turns out, the organizations in Los Angeles do not believe that this demand is going to go away. And in fact, 90% of LA's nonprofits expect demand to continue to grow in 2022. And that's why I want to keep emphasizing the word demand and the persistence of demand, and connected to the fact that most of the organizations are providing direct services. This is where the rubber meets the road in terms of the ability of us to operate as an equitable community. Finding number 2 is about racial equity and its importance to Los Angeles nonprofit organizations. First, BIPOC-led nonprofits have been advancing racial equity as a major programmatic focus of their work. And if you look at this chart, it's fairly dramatic. Now, all the organizations are committed to racial equity, but when you say a major programmatic focus of our work, the BIPOC-led organizations, 55% answer that perfectly describes us, not somewhat describes us, perfectly describes us. White-led organizations are active in this area, and I don't want to, give the impression that they're not. But in terms of perfectly describes us, it's a smaller percentage, 16%. And when you mix it all together, you end up with 40% in the total of LA. That programmatic focus, though, overall, is likely driven by the BIPOC-led organizations. Now we switch to something called DEI practices, which you have all heard about. It's a very important part of the way organizations operate. And here it turns out that white-led nonprofits conducted DEI practices at higher rates since 2020, not by tremendous amounts. But if you look at the programs on the left, developed and expanded services, developed policies and practices on board diversity, discussions with staff about DEI, and I'm going to skip one and come back to it, implemented performance metrics. But if you go to the fourth one, you start to get a clue that some of this may have to do with capacity. Had DEI professionals lead workshops, trainings on DEI to board leadership staff. And if you see here, by really a 2-to-1 edge, white-led nonprofits are more likely to do that. To me, that's going to be pretty clearly a capacity question. And when you are doing direct service work day after day with capacity challenges, the ability to hire professionals to do this kind of work. And we find in the little box on the right that nonprofits with larger budgets are most likely to conduct DEI activities since 2020. So sometimes the two charts about committing to racial equity as a fundamental piece of the mission and DEI practices are not the same thing. They overlap. They have a lot in common. We need both, but these differences are significant. Finding number 3. Funding did increase overall, but it didn't increase overall everywhere and for everybody. So if we look at increases in revenue since March 2020, during the pandemic, especially local, state, federal, by we mean government, local government, state government, federal government. Generally speaking, with the exception of corporate donations, and to some degree individual donors where it's evenly matched, white-led nonprofits actually experienced a higher degree of revenue increase. Now, the good news is they all increased. Everybody was reporting in all the communities that there was a great increase. Again, you have to ask yourself, is some of the ability to obtain revenue a capacity question. And when you think about what it takes to make the system work and to respond, this is something to think about. The revenue was going up, but it wasn't going up the same everywhere. This chart is really quite striking. If we only pull out African-American-led nonprofits and ask about reserves, meaning financial reserves, which all organizations know how important reserves are, only about a quarter of Black-led nonprofits report having reserves, really of any kind. And the others are all around a little bit over 50%, which could be better, because as anybody can tell you in the nonprofit world, reserves are fundamental to allowing you to carry out your mission. And of course, this is going to later turn out to be connected to whether you have unrestricted funding that allows you to move nimbly from one spot to another, and also not to constantly fear that you're in danger of closing your doors. And that's what reserves allow you to do. Number 4, LA nonprofits have a different experience than non-LA nonprofits in the survey. This is now we introduce the national for the first time. And first off, looking at all nonprofits in LA nonprofits are more likely to have publicly advocated for programs to advance racial equity in their communities. And the next bar is nonprofits excluding LA in the national survey. It shouldn't surprise us that this community as a whole has so much embraced the struggle to advance racial inequity and move toward equity. And more LA nonprofits have been advancing racial equity for more than 5 years. 48% to 33% of nonprofits in the sample outside Los Angeles. Now I want to introduce something we heard from our feedback groups and our advisory groups, and it's a particular word. You've heard about demand, you've heard about capacity. I want you to hear the word urgent. This is not a philosophical discussion. This is an urgent discussion, because what we're hearing is that meeting demand and funding are urgent issues for LA's nonprofits. In fact, if you look at the first chart, LA's nonprofits are seeing a much bigger demand than their national counterparts as a result of COVID. Just 72% to 47%. We are where the rubber meets the road in terms of demand. And LA, at the same time, are less likely to report reaching more than half of their funds from unrestricted funds. So here you have demand, capacity, and one's hands tied by having certain funding streams that you really can't adapt to the situation. This is a very urgent problem. We also found that it takes longer for LA's nonprofits to be reimbursed by government compared to nonprofits across the country. And we have heard from our advisory group, and it doesn't take long to get this discussion going, that the length of time to get reimbursed gets to the reserves and capacity question. If you don't have reserves and you're not getting paid, doesn't mean you're not being paid timely. It may mean that the rules by which you get paid are not flexible enough. They're set up to be too long. We also find that LA's nonprofits deal with the gigantic county departments, and that really a fairly large number, more than half, have entered into contracts with Los Angeles County. But at the same time, nonprofits by a fairly large margin don't feel that their work with the county covers the total costs of the work performed. And if you look at this chart, I'd say this is pretty dramatic, that the agree side is 19% that say that the county covers the full cost, this is the full cost issue, and well over a majority of all types of nonprofits say that that is not correct, that is not happening. But it turns out that if you want to provide direct services in Los Angeles, your main source is going to be the County of Los Angeles, because the city of LA does not provide social services. It's the county. And these departments are gigantic. These numbers here are in the billions. Public health, mental health, children and family services, public social services, health services, and they may each have their own culture, their own way of dealing with nonprofits, their own rules and regulations. And I wonder how many nonprofits have seen an application form from the county and just thrown up their hands and said, we don't have a grant writer on staff. And if we did, I'm not sure that we could actually make this work for us. This is a very important question going forward. Number 5, urgent need for full cost funding and staffing support, urgent. And this parallels the national scene, except in one area. Everyone's concerned about staff burnout, competitive pay, having enough staff. And by the way, of course, it's not just the nonprofit sector, everybody's dealing with this, but when you're dealing with it in the nonprofit service center and you're up to your ears in providing direct services, maybe with not enough reserves, but the piece that stands out for LA nonprofits is the high cost of living. And as I'm not going to be surprising anybody on this call, the cost of living is way out of line in Los Angeles. Well, that affects the other three. Staff burnout, the possibility that staff could leave for a place where the cost of living is lower, and you've got to figure out, while still being able to explain to funders that you may be asking for an increase in funding, not because you're not doing the work, but because you've got to keep the people who are doing the work. And the top three financial challenges for LA nonprofits: unrestricted revenue, raising funds that cover full costs. And I'm going to throw back that word urgent again, and achieving long-term financial sustainability. And once again, we see a difference. BIPOC-led organizations, 88% versus 69% of white-led nonprofits, which overlaps with larger budget size organizations, identify long-term financial sustainability as a challenge. Do any of us want to see organizations that are doing great work in the community have to close their doors because they can't find the situation that will enable them to have this long-term financial, let alone reserves, but to have long-term financial stability? From everything you've heard, there's a lot of challenges, but we are filled with hope that when we face the challenges head on, as we're doing today, and as you all are doing every day, that there is a path forward. Miguel Santana provided a quote for us to end with from the Committee of Greater LA, talking about the committee's really great work that I think you're all familiar with about racial inequity. And they're doing a lot of work to sustain equity in the nonprofit sector. But I want to address the last line. We look forward to advancing the analysis presented here for a more equitable and effective nonprofit sector for Los Angeles. That is our mission. That's our goal for today. It is our goal for the conversation to follow. It is that this is the beginning, that if you first face what's in front of you, that all of you and many of your colleagues have helped us to try to reveal and bring forward. It is the only path forward, but there will be a path forward. So I thank you for your attention and for being here today. The first step, of course, is to be in the room, and you're in the room. And I'm going to pass the conversation over to my good friend, Claire Knowlton, who's the Director of Consulting for the Nonprofit Finance Fund. And I'd like to remind you all to put your comments and questions into the chat. And we'll try to get as many of them into the conversation as we can. And once again, thank you to all of our partners and our organizations for this opportunity.
Thank you so much, Ray, for walking us through that data. I'm going to invite my panelist friends to turn on their cameras. As Ray said, my name is Claire Knowlton. I am a director with NFF's consulting practice based here in Los Angeles. And I am joined by a wonderful group of panelists: Derek Steele, Executive Director of Social Justice Learning Institute; Isela Gracian, Senior Deputy for Housing and Homelessness and Housing for LA County Supervisor Holly Mitchell, the 2nd District; Joanna Jackson, Vice President Programs at Weingart Foundation; and Leanne Chung, Executive Director of Khmer Girls in Action. Thank you all so much for joining us. I'm going to start by asking the panelists some questions, but if folks have questions for the panelists, we will have time to bring some of those in. So please do drop those into the chat and they will be moderated. So Rafe walked us through some really interesting findings, and I think there's quite a story that stands out. Black, Indigenous, people of color-led organizations are more likely to represent the communities that they serve. They are more likely to have seen an increase in demand for their services during the pandemic. They are more likely to have been engaged in racial equity work for longer than 5 years. And yet, we see a disconnect between the funding system and the work that's happening. So they are less likely to have large budgets, and they were less likely to report substantial increases in funding or as much increases in funding as white-led organizations, from government, from individuals, from foundations. So that's a pretty striking story. And we really want this data to be turned into action and turned into change. So Joanna, I would love to start with you. Based on these findings and sitting in the seat of philanthropy, what are the actions that you think philanthropy should be taking in response to this data?
Thanks so much, Claire, for the question. And I also first just want to thank the Pat Brown Institute and Dr. Sonnenschein and Nonprofit Finance Fund and the Committee for Greater LA just for supporting this deep dive on the well-being of our nonprofit partners here in LA County, and particularly for focusing on those that are BIPOC, Black, Indigenous, people of color led. And you just lifted up those data points, Claire. I'm not surprised by the data, but I just have to start off by saying that it still really stings to see the systemic differences in funding and financial position of our BIPOC-led organizations. And just one other point to lift up that Rafe shared that just startled me was to see that only a quarter of Black-led organizations have any reserves compared to over 50% of their counterparts. So this is systemic, this is structural, and I just have to say to philanthropy, we need to do our own work. We need to understand, dissect our own giving, the anti-Blackness, anti-Black racism that exists in our own practice. I want to lift up the work quickly of the Black Equity Collective that's trying to dismantle that. But to get to your question, what do we need to do? What does philanthropy need to do differently as I reflect on the challenges that Rafe lifted up? He talked about the top 4 staffing challenges that our partners are facing, the top 3 financial challenges. It was, raising unrestricted revenue, funds that cover full cost, long-term sustainability. These are all things that funders can address with our own practice, right? Organizations need multi-year, unrestricted, flexible funding at higher levels so that they can actually have the flexibility to respond to in real time, right? Respond in real time to and pivot in the environment that we're in, so they can plan, for their futures, so they can provide the wages that their staff deserve. We need to fund them like we want them to be able to achieve long-term sustainability. We also need to understand full cost. We can't consistently underfund organizations, provide less than it actually takes them to deliver, and expect them to remain healthy over the long term. So we understand what it really takes for organizations to deliver on their missions and provide it if we want them to be successful. We need to be leading with trust and transparency. And I know so many of my colleague funders responded with these kind of practices at the onset of the pandemic. These are practices that Weingart Foundation has been employing for years, that flexible, unrestricted funding, trying to lead with trust, trying not to have burdensome, application and procedures for folks to go through. But I hope it wasn't just a moment in time response for those that maybe pivoted during the pandemic and really understand now that it's a best practice for healthy, sustainable organizations. And then lastly, I just want to also, again, lift up the historic systemic underfunding for BIPOC-led organizations that, if these organizations have been doing so much with so little for so long, I think they've proven their viability, right? They may not have the ideal capital structure. They may not have reserves. Their board may not give at the higher levels. But I ask, are these the right indicators we need to be looking at, right? If these are the organizations that our most vulnerable communities trust, if they're the ones on the front lines responding, imagine what they could do if we were actually investing in them at levels that they actually need, right? Do we need to continue to give less to organizations that have historically already received less? That's not going to get us the change that we need. As Ray said, advancing racial equity is really squarely sitting on the shoulders of our BIPOC-led organizations. This is all work. This is work that everyone needs to be doing. But if we care about racial equity, if we care about this sector, we really need to be investing in these groups that are on the front lines representing their communities and doing the work. And if you can't do kind of the larger multi-year unrestricted grants right now, or if you have a hard time funding organizations that don't meet your criteria, then we need to ask, what else can we do, right? It doesn't have to be just that. Can you connect them to another funder? Can you provide some access to technical assistance, consultant support, et cetera? So I think there's more that we all can do. I'll stop here.
Thank you so much for that, Joanna, and for also just lifting up, that equity isn't just about fairness, it's about impact. And we're really talking about funding organizations equitably so that we get better results for all of our communities. Isela, I would love to turn to you with the same question. Sitting in the county, listening to this data, what kind of actions would you like to see the county take in response?
Yeah, thank you, Claire. Thank you, everybody that put this event together, and to the nonprofit leaders that participated in the survey and sharing your voices. I too, like Joanna, the numbers weren't necessarily surprising to me, and they still definitely sting as the word that she used, but strongly bothered by them, because it's really more of a question of like, what do we do now, right? And because for a lot of folks I'm sure on the call, this isn't new information, particularly for Black, Indigenous, people of color-led organizations. Like, we live it every day, right? We experience it every day. Up until a year and a half ago, I was in the nonprofit side of the table. And being in county government right now, I think I'm very honored, and why I joined Supervisor Mitchell's team is because she is really leading and the charge at the county around equity and honestly dismantling the systemic racism that is embedded in the practices within government. So what can the county do? There's a couple things we've already have underway. One of them is equity and contracting that Supervisor Mitchell led, and being able to get more of the departments to really take a deeper dive into their practices around contracting and how to make that more accessible for organizations that are doing the work on the ground. We moved on the equity index that's around the ARPA dollars from the federal government, and being able to direct those to communities that are have historically been not reached through the work of the county. And I think there's still a lot of work to be done. And when I saw the slide on the time it's taking for reimbursements from the county, definitely not acceptable. And as Dr. Sonnenschein pointed out, each of the departments have their own culture, they have their own admin team, they have different ranges of capacity. And I think part of the work around the equity and contracting is really looking at how can we at the county be able to have common practices around across the different departments to be able to facilitate the grant making, the contracting, and be able to reach more organizations that historically have not been able to access government dollars because of the challenges in applying and in floating, right? A lot of the government contracts are on a reimbursable basis. So we have a couple of departments that have been able to put some, when the contract is signed, they do an upfront payment and then it moves on to reimbursement that helps. So I think the more departments that could do that within the county will help organizations. And that's right now what we're doing, but what we're doing at the county. And again, we can do more around facilitating the contracts, making it easier. I know I would love to see like one universal application so that folks aren't applying to all the different departments. And I know our team is really working hard around that. And then I just want to call into conversation that for BIPOC-led organizations, everybody's operating within a white male-led framework of organizations, right? And until we really get deeply into like what are different practices that are different and pushed up like.
Oh, Isela, I think we've lost your connection.
Have and see. Oh, no.
I think you're back. Can you repeat your last point? You were saying,
okay.
Looked at organizations through a white male-led lens, and then can you add on from that?
Yes. So I think once we really see an uplift and support a different way of running organizations and being in community. And it's being in government right now, it's probably one of the harder institutions to get to that place, but we're at LA County, you know, we have our anti-racism, diversity and inclusion RD program, and we're really digging deep and pushing as much as possible from our team around this. But I think that's important to acknowledge and uplift, that if we really want to transform how funding is done across government and foundations, that we really need to look at like those practices. And I also was thinking about the Black Equity Collective, got to join one of their sessions and shared with our team the conversations that are happening there, so that we can uplift some of those learnings and weave them into the work that we're doing. Yeah, so at the county, we have a lot to do to streamline, to have shared practices across the departments, and to make it easier to be able to access the dollars that the county has for the direct services. And I'll stop there.
Thank you so much, Isela. Let me go ahead and turn to our nonprofit panelists. Leanne, I'm curious, based on what Joanna shared, what Isela shared, what they see as potential actions for philanthropy and for government. What's your response to that? And what sort of actions do you want to see coming out of this?
Yes, hello, can everyone hear me?
Yes, we can.
Yeah, good morning, everyone. Yeah, thank you, Joanna and Isela, for sharing. You know, I think first and foremost, we are actually really lucky in LA County to have great leaders, you know, like both of you. And I was taking vigorous notes because I'm thinking about, you know, ways in which I am going to be responding to what you all have shared. And as I'm listening, you know, I was thinking that I'm going to organize my response in kind of 3 key areas. First is around, you know, that we need organized institutions. Second is around we need organized people. And then lastly, we're going to need organized money. And so, you know, as we're talking about on the institutional front, Isela, thank you so much for sharing the piece around the equity in contracting that's in the work. And I really love the idea around like a universal application and potentially how that might play out and what that might look like. Because I think for us, you know, we really need institutionalized practices and policies that are equitable and universal across the departments. Having consistent information across departments will help nonprofits save precious staff time in trying to navigate different processes and systems. And I think for many of us who have kind of been in the weeds of that for a long time, it will make such a huge difference. The other key piece that you know, I want to bring up on the institutional front is really thinking about how we can create opportunity for nonprofits to co-design or weigh in on the granting and contracting process, and having and have some ongoing feedback loop so that we can be better partners to each other. You know, to both like build new relationships as well as strengthen existing relationships. We learn from many nonprofit leaders that the ease of engagement comes down to relationship with each other, with many of the departments. And so having, you know, both having the relationship, but also the understanding of each other's work really could help us build trust. And to me, you know, it really, like, the question is, what would it mean to operate differently and to shift the culture in departments, you know, to do so, right? And the other piece is, you know, when Wave was presenting, the data around 41% of nonprofits survey that they don't even apply for government grant. And government grant is like a huge source of money. And it makes me think about like, what do we need to do to create more access to government grant? You know, a lot of folks don't apply because they are either not eligible or there were enough barriers in place to not apply in the first place. But I would love to see how we could decrease the barriers, particularly for smaller nonprofits and BIPOC-LED nonprofit. And can we institutionalize easier access and support, and what will need to change for that to happen, and what are other models or opportunities to explore. During the first year of the pandemic, KGA was fortunate enough to receive an equity grant through the county to support education, outreach, and system navigation around the pandemic. And in this particular experience, we were able to receive this grant through a pass-through process with an outside re-granting agency. And we did our, excuse me, we did our due diligence, and we had a few back and forth, but the whole experience was not painful. And so I thought it was great that the county was able to pivot in order to deal with the health crisis, in order to deal with the pandemic. And what this experience showed me in terms of like having gone through that whole process is that pivoting and making adjustment is possible. Despite how big a lot of our county departments are, that folks have been able to make the pivots and make adjustments. And it would be really awesome if we can review some of these practices or other practices that have been tried, pilot new ideas, and not go back to business as usual. And I think that's, the key thing here. And then, in responding to philanthropy, I want to thank Joanna for, sharing a lot of the stuff that Weingart Foundation has been doing, because Weingart Foundation has been such a leader in a lot of the trust-based giving, the multi-year general operating support. And I think just such a model in what philanthropy can do and what they could do correctly. The other thing that I know that Weingart Foundation do that Joanna didn't get a chance to mention is that Weingart Foundation survey their grantee a lot and create space for a grantee to be in conversation with them. And I feel like that is just such a great practice in terms of being able to just check in about like, hey, this is what we're doing. What's your thoughts around it? And I think that was really helpful. And it also gives us a sense from the outside what they are doing internally. And that increased the trust building between the grantee and the funder. And I think that's really important. And for other funders out there, in this moment, it would be really great to really think about how folks can re-examine some of the internal practices and policy. And the shift that folks have done during the pandemic, there's been an amazing shift that I've seen in the field that philanthropy have done to be responsive and to get money out to the field. I think there's been some amazing shift. And similar to what Joanna had mentioned, I would love to see like further and ongoing commitment. And I also have a curiosity, are folks thinking about going back to how they used to operationalize their grant giving now that things have shifted a little bit? So, and then the other, let me see, I was on institution. Okay, so the next piece is really around like thinking about how we organize people. So I know a lot of really good people in philanthropy and in government. And oftentimes when I talk to one of those folks, I would think to myself, wouldn't it be great if others were more like them in their field? And what's cool about LA County is we have a lot of good people in philanthropy and in government. And I would love to see folks organize others in their field and in their sector, right? So share what your foundation or your departments are doing and invite others to join you in taking action, because we need to organize our folks, we need to organize people, and we need to get those people then to organize other people. And to me, this is how we create a larger shared sentiment about what we could do now and how we could do more. And that's one way that I have seen, folks being effective in the field, is to talk to others that are in their field, because there is a power dynamic if nonprofit is just saying what we're saying versus if a funder is just talking to other funder, or if a government official is talking to another government official. And so I think that, that will be a really great way to build shared sentiment around this. And then the last piece is around organizing money, so organized money. And what I was thinking around with this is that, we know the nonprofit sector is financially stretched, and Joanna brought this up as well around, really thinking about focusing on paying the full cost of operation, and paying full costs is also directly connected to long-term sustainability of organizations. And so, what's really crazy, sometimes I get surveys or I get questions from folks that ask, what's your long-term sustainability plan for your organization? And then me in the back of my head is like, well, first of all, you're not paying full cost, so I don't know how I could answer this question about long-term sustainability. And and I had to sit on that question for a while. But with that said, just for our government and our philanthropic leaders who understand what it means to cover the full cost of operation with increasing demands and other capacity challenges. So how can we organize money to support full cost operation? Can we give a little more? Can we move money around? Can we get a match? Can we find new money? And I know I'm not the only nonprofit director having sleepless nights, worrying about my staffing, worrying about our revenue, if we will be able to meet full costs, who will help us cover the unsexy overhead costs while we're doing, while we're doing good right now, but will the recession and its aftermath sink us? Those are just kind of like the questions that goes through my head quite a lot. And the reality here is that as organizations and nonprofit, we have had so many, our organizations have been confronted with so many political flashpoints in the last few years, right? From the pandemic to the racial uprising to infuriating Supreme Court rulings, and there's going to be many more stuff coming down the line. And and for me, the context of all that makes it so important right now for us to get things right, and to ease the burden on many of our organizations and groups who are oftentimes the lifelines to our community members, our social and political lifelines, serving some of the most vulnerable.
And Leanne, I'm going to jump in here just a moment because I want to make sure I can get to Derek as well and have a chance for some questions from the audience. Thank you so much for lifting up the importance of relationships, systems, money, organizing people, just amazing insights. Derek, I would love to turn to you and find out, based on what you've heard so far, your reactions to the data, what kind of actions do you think nonprofits should be taking? Anything else you wanted to hear from our government or philanthropic representatives here?
Well, I just want to follow up on what Leanne said, right? Like, I want to underscore her points. Organized institutions, organizing the people, and organizing the resources. Like, it can't be more spot on as to what is actually needed if we're going to move forward in a way, or actually if the people that we're looking to serve and making sure that they are made whole and have the ability to live liberated, whole, and free lives, like if that is the focus and that's the point of what we're trying to achieve, especially in this time that we're in, we're going to have to really start to think differently, right? And I want to lift up, the nonprofit finance fund, as well as the Pat Brown Institute of Public Affairs and Committee for Greater LA, particularly the Black Experience Action Team and the work that was happening in that space too, right? Because in those spaces, because of this survey, you get a chance to actually see what we were already seeing in our lived experience and the conversations that we were having during those times in these different spaces that we created, organized by ourselves, right, to try to make sure that as institutions that are doing work in community, we have the ability to make sure that we understand what's happening on the ground and learning from each other and creating these learning spaces. But this survey puts into qualitative and qualitative data that can speak to what's really going on in the field that we can use as a baseline for how we need to shift to the future, right? So I mean, and not only just lifting them up, I want to lift up my friends who are on the panel today. I want to lift up the folks who were a part of these collaborative spaces that I can name off, but I won't do that in essence of time. I also want to lift up every community member, community leader, and every peer nonprofit who pushed through the setbacks and barriers of the pandemic and made their voices heard, even after. I mean, starting with the many of them starting with the Summer of Social Action in 2020 and getting to date. But here's the point, right? Like to answer the question, we can't use 20th century ways of operating as if they can be the solution for today's issues and needs, right? If we're being completely transparent, we are in a space even where this is probably going to be our last boomer president, right? So there's a shift that's happening. People are starting to think about their level of capacity and their needs in a way that is unprecedented for things that have happened in the past. We can't use the ways of being from yesteryear as the solutions for how we're going to be able to move forward from here, right? And so these conversations that we've been having anecdotally in these different spaces about what the future can hold and what it needs to be, I think Leanne put her finger right on it. We got to organize these institutions in ways that we have not done before, and center that organizing around folks who have never been at the core of the issues that we're trying to solve. We're going to have to organize the people, not just those who are decision makers, but also making sure that the voice of those of the people who are most impacted are centralized in the ways that we're organizing people in the direction that we're headed in, right? How do we actually make sure that those resources that are there can be brought forward in a way that is going to be transformative for the paradigms that people are existing in a day-to-day basis? And like this is not new information. We're doing this work already, right? So this is why this survey and the information that's happening there can help to amplify the work that's already taking place. I give an example of this, the Bold Vision space, where you have community-based organizations of all kinds that are coming together to have a conversation around what the needs are for youth throughout LA County, right? And also our philanthropic partners who are helping to be a part of this space, but actually letting community voice lead the way as to how we take things to the next level, right? That's just one example, but I can give you so many more of how we're starting to shift the paradigm now. And we just need to be able to amplify and actually get the resources behind it towards this direction. I'll end by saying this. Nonprofit organizations are no longer here to just try and solve problems that the quote unquote market can't solve or won't solve, right? This is not just a space where we're now just having people who do have the resources to just kind of park dollars and let it be what it is, so we can do some really nice things to do some feel good stuff. Nonprofit organizations in this third industrial revolution that's actually taking place right now, right before our eyes, are going to be the centerpiece of what service actually is in our community. So we have to start looking at this as a part of the economic ethos that needs to be the linchpin to make sure that all people have the opportunity to thrive, right? The way that the market has operated beforehand and centuries before where we are right now, those operations have left people out, have capitalized, quote unquote, on people. If we are going to have a people-centered, a care-first centered and focused way of living and a way of being, we're going to have to really start to reformulate how we even think about the nonprofit space, because this is the centerpiece to be able to actually transform the way that life actually can be for all of us to be able to live whole and free lives. So I'm really excited about where we're headed and where we're going. this is a major step in the right direction to identify what the needs are so that these nonprofit organizations can actually thrive, so that people can thrive with them. And I'm here to be a part of all of the different parts of the conversation to get us there.
Love it. Thank you for bringing us home with that, Derek. Thank you to this amazing panel for your reactions, your reflections on what actions need to come out of this survey, because this is not just data for data's sake. We want to use this for advocacy. We want to use this for action. And so to that end, I want to make sure that the audience knows that NFF is committed to making this data available in ways that are needed for you to do your advocacy. So there will be a report coming out on the analysis that we've done in partnership with the Pat Brown Institute, over the next month, but we are also committed to running additional slices of data. So, I saw in the comments here, like, hey, what about women of color led organizations? Like, what's their experience? We can run that analysis for you, right? So tell us at NFF what you need. You can email survey@nff.org, and there's lots of ways that we can slice and dice this data. We want it to be a tool for the advocates in the field to really help bring a spotlight on these long-standing inequities and really start making traction toward closing those. One thing I did want to address, the anti-Blackness that we see reflected in the data here, that we see especially within that reserves data. I think it's just really important that all funders recognize that the accounting mechanism by which organizations build reserves is unrestricted revenue that is greater than expenses at the end of the year, a surplus, letting organizations generate an unrestricted surplus. And so for philanthropy to close that gap, that means looking at who we are funding and how we are funding them, and making sure that Black leaders are getting unrestricted, sizable, multi-year grants to close that gap in reserves. That's the mechanism by which it will happen. And then for government, we never expect that a small business is going to do the work of the government for free, let alone at a loss. But that is what we expect of the nonprofit sector. So we need to see how we get to equity in contracting, parity in contracting between the way small businesses are treated and the way nonprofits are treated, so that we can generate a surplus and be able to build those reserves in that long-term financial sustainability. So with that, I want to thank everyone again for your participation. Please reach out to NFF, reach out to the Pat Brown Institute. I know there's some links that have been dropped in the chat. We'd love to be in dialogue with you about how we can make this, the data from the survey, available, effective, and a tool for change, not just a report that sits on a desk. So more to come from us. Thank you so much. And I think we are at a close. Tatiana, I believe we're at an end. So if there's anything else we need to drop in the chat or say, please go ahead and do so now. Thank you.